How is everyone this morning, afternoon? Good? Davos haze going well? Yeah. Why didn't you start, David? Do you want to share your origin story and your journey to this point?
Sure. Well, and Brian gave a little bit, but there's probably something that needs to be sort of pulled back. So my mom was a school teacher, and my father was a Methodist minister. And they definitely instilled that if you have talents and abilities, you need to use those talents and abilities to help others. And that was just a motivation. And I would just implore all of us here, if you're lucky enough to be present here at WEF at Davos, that also means you have an obligation to think about how you can use those talents for others. And along the way, of course, being a preacher's kid, my rebellion was to try and figure out who my dad really worked for. And so I was just interested in I was good with computers, and I started building simulations. And you can remember, even in the mid to early 90s, there was conversations about ozone layer deterioration, there was conversation about greenhouse effects, and so I pulled all the research I could find and actually built some computer simulations. And that was a greenhouse model back in 1993, 1994, caught the attention of the US government, and they said, we might have some work for you. And that led to, at the time, it was 1995, so you can guess how old I was if you do the extrapolation of the ages. There was a thing called the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization, which was a legacy from the 80s, which was, if you heard of Star Wars defense, but it was actually trying to figure out how we could use these satellites for civilian purposes. So one was to pick up crop growth from space, try to figure out famines in advance, to try to pre-position resources to try and help out in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I got to lead a team that actually picked up forest fires from space, scanned the wind conditions, scanned the topography, and tried to guess where the forest fires might go. Now, I couldn't fully declassify my Westinghouse Science Fair project at the time, but that's okay. I raise that, though, because I'm a big believer that it's actually more important the questions we ask of the world than the answers we give. And if anything, that's more important nowadays now than ever because of the rate of change that's happening. If you don't ask more beautiful questions, you're not going to get more beautiful answers. And so circling back to what I would love to hear your thoughts on, I feel like we're in a world in which we're not asking more beautiful questions. And that's partly because I think there's a lot of doom and gloom. People in some respects are overloaded with all the possible things that might go wrong. And the reality is that's always been the case. It's just that we now are bombarded with that. And the other thing is that good news media doesn't really sell. It's actually a repeat of the 1890s, 1900s, where sensationalist news media may have actually led to the U.S. to go to war with Spain over a disinformation event. And so I think partly when we first met, and we first met at the beginning of this week, what can we do to create messages of hope that create win-wins for parties that traditionally might see themselves as either adversaries or not having anything in common or even having disparate interess? And so I'll turn it over to you. Tell a little bit about your origin story, and then maybe we can brainstorm a little bit about how might we mobilize to actually create that better questions of hope for the future.
I love this, David. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be sharing this with this YGL, ancient brother from the future, clearly. Such a delight to be here. Lucian Tarnowski and I, as Brian shared, Brian's done, I think, now 5 of the Up games. It's a time-traveling game where we step outside of the present moment and we step into the future we want to see. So you play the game by playing your future self, where everything you can imagine for yourself, for your communities, for your family, for your organization, for society, for culture has happened. So the mission of the game is to tell the greatest story ever told. Or we could say the greatest story never yet told. And it's all about this notion that we're being conquered by dystopia and apathy. The predominant narrative in the world about AI, for example, is AI is going to take our jobs and destroy humanity, and it's an extinction level event. We believe at United Planet that the narrative is the front line. The stories we tell creates the world we are going to live in. And so it's never been so important that we craft unifying narratives that doesn't separate, doesn't other people. And so going into my origin story, I was incredibly lucky to the parents I was born to. I'll mention my father, who was in a wheelchair from the age of 28 when he wrote the first guidebook for Bali in 1958. He got polio. And he spent the 60s, the early 60s, doing a very famous expedition, which was all about the future of humanity in a way. It was called the Unbeaten Track Expedition. And he traveled around the world in his wheelchair over 3 years, traveling almost 100,000 miles around the world in his wheelchair, doing the largest study of disability ever done. And so this was a big question, a big kind of pursuit of like, how do we include the 10% of the world's population that are in some way disabled or differently abled, to be able to include them in the workforce? Because my father realized that if you don't contribute to your community, you typically exist rather than live. And so often people had lost their dignity. And I think this is a question to come back to with the question of AI and the future of jobs. Is like, what is dignity in the future in a world where, frankly, I'm really excited because we're going to have to work a whole lot less. A lot of the menial tasks that are there in the world, we can actually automate, and that's ultimately going to be a positive thing. And I think reframing this notion that everybody needs jobs and actually reframing what it is to create value and to contribute to society is a really important question. And so I got involved in the foundation. I started going to India from the age of 9. My father's adopted father was the most famous social worker in India, a man called Baba Amte, who was the protege of Gandhi. And he started with the premise, give them a chance, not charity. I think this is really key, is like from universal basic income to what is universal earned income for you contributing to your community. And I think we'll touch more on this in terms of how do we liberate not just some of us, but all of us, and how do we design our world, not based on national strategies and corporate strategies, but really begin to enter this planetary age, because that's what the age of AI is allowing us to do, is to think as a spaceship Earth, as a crew team on spaceship Earth. And so my journey, I got very involved. I was very passionate about the whole field. Ahura is part of. I started I fundraised for a IT and English language school training blind girls IT skills from the age of 18. That led me into starting a company called Brave New Talent, which we're on a mission to democratize education and meritocratize opportunity. That brought me to Davos 16 years ago, and I've been coming ever since. That company, we were beginning to apply early AI tools. We were using Watson. We were the first to create a knowledge graph using social learning content, which we would use different machine learning curation tools to curate content for example, the world's largest community around transitioning veterans, the world's largest ecosystem of collaborators in the field of population health. And then what I realized, having spent 12 years of my life designing something like 1,000 multi-stakeholder communities, is I realized that we have a crisis of narrative. And I started to realize, having been to like 100 World Economic Forum events over the years, that those, if you like, in the cockpit were really like not incentivized to be thinking about systems change. They were being incentivized to think about how do we adapt and tweak what we're currently operating. The whole notion of new paradigm system design was too risky, frankly, to their stock prices. And so I started to realize that I was in a position of privilege that I could step into the next paradigm. And that's where United Planet began, and I'm going to share more on that. But I'm going to go back to you, David, to say, what do you believe is the kind of questions we need to be asking right now with the rapid advancement of AI? How do we ask the questions of who are we in this new world of exponential technologies, with exponential risk on one polarity and exponential opportunity way beyond anything we can currently imagine on the other?
So recognizing at this Davos, it's been AI, and you're probably overloaded on AI. I'm actually going to say what's missing is the people-centeredness of it. and thinking about how it can uplift individuals or groups. And really I want to explore that further, because there are some places that may stick the human-centered moniker or the different monikers. But what I really want to encourage is, one, we are still probably at less than 10% of understanding what makes us us. You mentioned the stat about 1 in 10. I think now the stat actually is, in our lifetimes, 1 in 4 of us at some point in time in our lives will have a different ability need, a different ability capability. Think about that, 1 in 4 of us. But then think about how accessible Davos is. Just raising that. And that's not even counting for neurodiversity. And where we're beginning to unpeel that as well, and understanding that actually these things that we thought we labeled maybe possibly as problems actually were possibly gifts. It was just that we were not engaging those people in the right way to bring their gifts. And so what I really want to see is, whether it's AI or some other technology, how can we actually do it so we understand the individual, the person, their environment, so that we amplify their gifts as much as possible and try to mitigate those things that they may actually find challenging or difficult. I often say the Turing test was the wrong test. Turing test, for the short note, is the machine trying to deceive you that it's a human. Why do we need that? We got plenty of other deceptive people in the world. We don't need more deceptive machines. What I really want is the test of, who are you, either you as an individual, you as a team, you as an organization, and how can we make all of you better? In some respects, I feel like we're at a disadvantage with this panel because we're talking to them. In some respects, there is collective intelligence in this room. Of course, it would become a cacophony, but maybe if we each had different individual agents as opposed to a monolithic brain that's right now being sold to us, and that's my lament, is we're all being sold monolithic brains as opposed to individualized agents that you can then explicitly in advance, before you filter, say, here's how I want to interact. But then we can actually have a conversation. And I'm real quick before I go back to you. In economics, there's a thing called the social dilemma, and it's not the documentary, which I kind of lament, because the documentary sort of observes a problem and gives you no actual things you can individually do, which is my lament about it. It really should have spent at least half, if not 2/3, talking about, here's what you can do to empower yourself. But in economics, there's a thing called the social dilemma. And let's say I give everybody in this room $20, and I say you have a choice. You can hold on to that $20, or you can put it in the pot. And if half the people in the room put $20 in the pot, everybody will get $50 back. So the first time we do it, of course, everybody puts their money in the pot. But it's a repeated game. And let's say even more, I'm going to put you all behind computer terminals where it's anonymous. So you won't know who contributes or not. By the second and third round, some of you have figured out, wait, I can hold on to my $20. And everybody else who put their money in, I'll get $50 back. So I'll have $70 as opposed to a net $50. And so by round 4 or 5 of this multi-round game, we have now collapsed in a state where nobody is contributing. Now, it's interesting to try and explore, how do we shift back? Now, one, interesting enough,
The return to the commons.
the return to the commons.
The crisis-
Exactly. That's
the
what
cri-
this is. This is Eleanor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize, sadly passed away, but Eleanor Ostrom, this is the commons, and this is what she researched. So what's interesting is, one is punishment. I'm not a fan of punishment, but I want to put that out there. So this blows the minds of economics, because economists would tell you, what should you do in every situation? You should defect at every turn. Think about that. By the way, we are the World Economic Forum. That means we are underpinning ourselves off a philosophy that says defection is the best strategy. And that's what economists say. So it blows their mind that if you charge people money, let's say I charge you $10 to punish those people who didn't contribute, people will actually do that. But again, that's blowing the minds of the economists, because economists would say, 1, you should always defect, and 2, you shouldn't pay any money to punish anybody. That they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. But let's say we don't want to do punishing. The second thing that's interesting is if you allow communication. It's an anonymous communication. Again, I don't know who contributed or not every round. That's enough for people to go online and start saying, who's the people that are defecting? This is a group issue. We want to come together. Now, little inside note, the people who complained the loudest about the people defecting, guess who defected first? That tells you something about human beings. There's actually an interesting theory that says we evolved communication to shift those of us who would defect into recognizing that this is a group effort as opposed to an individual effort. And then finally, the thing that blows people's minds, because this really blows the economist's mind, is if I charge you to communicate, that's actually faster at getting people to go back to it. But I raise that because, again, there's all these interesting phenomenologies beyond the individual that we could begin to unpack. And so I'll go back to you with the games and thinking about how can we construct it so it's both a exploratory message of hope, but it's also beginning to flex those muscles that say, we've grown up in a system that has been rooted in economics that would tell people that actually you should defect, you should deceive, you should convince everyone else to contribute while you do the exact opposite thing. How do we show a different system? I don't know what the right word is. It's definitely not economics. Sorry, World Economic Forum. But whatever that system is, that is preparing us for the future as opposed to the current status quo, which is defect and deceive.
Brilliant, brilliant. Absolutely. I totally agree with this point, because I think we've been deeply conditioned, probably far more than we can even know. Deeply conditioned, like plants, that have grown up in a soil that is not healthy for us. Like the environment that we've created, we've been conditioned to think this is normal. But if you look at history and we take a longer horizon of time, our ancestors would be literally turning in the grave as to the lives we live today. You know, they'd be really impressed with infant mortality. You know, I don't want to be a doomer here, but the way we treat each other and the collapse of community, I think kind of originated, I trace it back to Descartes. Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, cut our heads off from our bodies and cut our umbilical cord to our mother, Gaia, nature, and we became separate from nature, and we began to create a relationship with nature where we are dominating, we are conquering, we are, you know, it is at our disposal, if you like. And so the notion of our common unity, our community approach, this is how we have lived for 200,000 years. And even Darwin, you know, the survival of the fittest was essentially a spin, a propaganda spin by the National Geographic Society of the British, that were trying to prove that there is natural law for how the British aristocracy were on the top. You know, so we've seen the manipulation over centuries to create, if you like, this story of the world we live in today, that the American dream, even though so many of us know that's hollow, that's been what's propagating. And it's propagated, you know, you see in Davos that, you know, the way we treat billionaires, for example, as these like superior citizens, how do we go from billionaires to billions of heirs? How do we change the ambition of what it is that we're aspiring to as humanity? How do we evolve that from a question perspective? And I think a big part of it is stepping out of the conditioning, and how do we create the places, if you like, the rituals, the experiences, the immersive environments that allow us to reprogram, to repattern, to question everything. And we're not the first to do this. You know, indigenous communities around the world have created rites of passage that shape identity and actually create a collective belief system, a collective belonging. You know, the Greeks, for nearly 2,000 years, longer than the Catholic Church, had the Eleusinian mysteries, the greater and lesser mysteries. And if you wanted to be a leader in Greece, you had to have been initiated through these mysteries. And one of the things they did that kind of was one of the points that inspired me around the Up Games is they stepped outside of normal time. Because I advocate, and this is a key point here, I would say that I believe time is hiding in plain sight as the most powerful design tool we have to reimagine our world. That time, if you think of time, a bit like what Stanford and IDEO has created with design thinking, that they flipped the model of design and they said, rather than designing products and services, let's ask our users questions and do user-centric design so that we actually end up, it might not even be a product we create. It might be something completely different. But that flip in the design approach that design thinking created, we need for systems change. And I advocate that time is the greatest tool we have for that. So when we do what the Greeks were doing, they had two words for time. There was chronos, clock time, linear time, like the now, that we live and we kind of have been deeply conditioned by in our life. But they had another word for time, which was kairos. And kairos, if you like, is the past, present, and the future collapsed into the now, the deep now, I like to call it. And kairos is where the Greeks would step into during the Eleusinian mystery. They would step outside of time and they would ask questions. How do we design our society, our civilization, based on first principles, based on what is true today, always has been true, and always will be true? What a novel thought than the current short-term, profit-centric, self-centric, the I over the we that we currently have in our present world. What if we were to start designing our AI frameworks, incentives, based on timeless principles for collective thriving? That's the key here, is like, what questions are we programming, and how can we learn from civilizations, cultures, indigenous communities around the world? How can we learn from them so that we can actually encode these tools so that they let the best of us shine, so that they let us reach our fullest individual and collective potential and lead to our own flourishing? And I think this is the key point we're at right now, is we're at this enormous opportunity, because despite all of the advances, talent remains the world's most wasted resource. And so if we can tap into that collective potential, what I like to call the harmonic flow of teams, and tap into our collective intelligence and augment that with artificial intelligence, so it becomes augmented intelligence, human first. And this is where the whole master-slave crisis comes in, which I'd love to share, because I think we're actually at a tipping point where this decade is the decade where we decide, we are the choosing ones, we decide, is it going to be the machines that we give our sovereignty to, the AI that we give away our sovereignty to, or are we going to design the systems with choice such that we are sovereign over those technologies, and that they are supporting our own becoming and our own flourishing?
Well said. So maybe since I don't know how much time Brian gave us, but we want to respect everybody's time and maybe get to questions, maybe we can just sort of go to the lightning, sort of like, how could we make this real? Obviously, you've been doing this. You've been incredibly successful. I'm going to toss out the idea that, part of the organization I'm with now, we were created in the late 80s to try and prevent World War III. And if you look around the world right now, again, want to be optimistic. I believe optimists do change the future, but you also have to be pragmatist. That at the moment we have at least 3 regional crises. Who knows what's going to happen between Pakistan and Iran at the moment? Who knows what's happening in Ecuador? We may have 4 or 5 by the end of the calendar year. So there is clearly a need to fill these spaces with pragmatic ways to try and figure out, how can I lessen the tensions and the conflicts that are becoming kinetic at the moment between people. And so let's put forward, maybe if you could real quick, how do we move this forward so that next year and the year after that, let's think two years horizon, so next year and the year after that, what could we do if we are going into a period where we may be entering more and more human volatility, precisely because all these disruptions are making some people think, I can defect from the social dilemma and I can start taking my toys and going home and benefit off the profits of others, as opposed to, I think we're losing our mics, by the way. Anyway, so you can think about how we then go forward from there and think about, how do we actually lessen the likelihood of regional crises.
And I love what you're doing, David, here. And one of the key tenets we have, the way the game works is it's an elemental journey. So we have the water team, fire team, air team, and earth team. And every fire team joins the fire league. And one of the questions we ask is, what is the story of planetary peace and justice? How did we achieve planetary peace and justice? So, an example might be, we're inviting Pussy Riot to come and join an up game to sing the song of the feminine uprising that created the Meta-Slavic identity, that was an identity that went above the nation identity of being Russian or being Ukrainian, to create a continent-wide uprising that challenged the current failing nation-state governance that is failing the people, and is able to leapfrog how we do this. And if we can tell the stories, there's nothing more powerful than a well-told story whose time has come. And so if we can tell the stories become the front line. So what is the story around how we achieve peace in the Middle East? Like, I ask you that, ponder on that. What is the story? Rather than picking sides, let's pick stories. And so if we think about that, one of the things I would love to do is do a game in Jerusalem and do a game in Persepolis in Iran on planetary peace. The places where people least likely, that's the place that most people in the world might think World War III is going to come from. But how do we use that noospheric awareness of those places to bring people together to say, we need to be architects of the future we wish to see. It is in our hands and we are the choosing ones, and we're not going to let this ridiculousness that's currently going on be the default in our world. And so we're going to step outside of time in a place that we can run circles around the current stupidity that's going on, and we're going to use the best of us to send like javelins through time like snipers, telling the stories of transformation. And then once we have the stories, we can develop the strategies. Once we can develop the strategies, we can develop the financial incentives. Then we can turn the flow of money to actually come and incentivize the planetary outcomes necessary for a thriving civilization in harmony with all life.
Applause. So I think we're probably about to go to questions. I will build on what you say, because I like to do jazz improv, and so I'll try to add 3 harmonies from my own experiences doing something similar, usually in non-attribution context and in ways that people don't hear about. Based on what I would say. First is, everybody likes to be the hero in their own journey. In fact, that's kind of necessary to still continue to survive. But recognize that everybody likes to think they're the hero in their journey, even people that you may not agree with. And so part of the art of a good story helps people that may have differing ways of being that hero in the journey find a way that is less violent and is less centric to just themselves. But as we go into November 2024, and who knows what happens after that for both the US and the world, recognize that all those people that you may not agree with, they all think they're being a hero in the moment. The second thing I would say is, again, we began this with, I tried to figure out who my dad worked for. And my dad being a Methodist minister. I would say you could imagine that we know that stories trigger emotions in people. You told some story, you got a response from people. We want that. We know that you can shape stories that cause people to change their behavior. I tell people that I ate these berries, they made me violently ill. No, but you don't have to experience that. You've heard about it. I tell you about a different experience. I did the following thing. I went and I ran 3 miles. It felt great. Now you're actually motivated to do it. So we humans can exchange information that triggers emotions that shape our behaviors. Those behaviors, if you do them enough, become sticky. They become habits. And so as an evolutionary biologist, I would say, unfortunately, we humans are imperfect because evolution, quite frankly, nature's out to get you. That's not a bad thing. It's recognizing that actually out of that creative destruction comes beauty. It becomes all the diversity that is our planet. But it is a yin-yang. And it is recognizing that in some respects, we have the next obligation, the next step, to create stories that overcome the imperfection that makes us people. Because we're on a planet of 8 billion people. That's not how we evolved. We evolved in a world in which, in your short lifespan, you probably ran into 80 people in your entire lifespan, and not all of them were your immediate family members, but a majority were. Nowadays, I guarantee you, you've met more than 80 people on an hourly basis or more. None of them are your family members. And so we have to figure out how we overcome who we are as a species through ways that hopefully uplift us up. The last thing I will say, though, and whether this is Mike Tyson or someone else, is no plan survives someone getting punched in the face. And so we will create the stories, but we will recognize those are stories that are not over and done with. It is going to need to be continuously updated and shared by the community. Because if we think we're done with just one story, again, that punch in the face is going to come. And so I think it's now time to maybe see if folks have questions. And maybe, Brian, if you want to lead with the first question, I'm going to give you 30 seconds as I sort of lead. But I would say to you, I mean, again, I've heard a lot of conversations about let's do this, let's do this, let's do this at WEF. Here's what I would say. If you're going to pin your hopes on somebody else doing something, nothing's going to happen. We are the cavalry. And there is an epidemic of learned helplessness we've got to figure out how we are those different grains of sand on the hill that if we each take a small step can begin that avalanche that takes us to a different place. So with that, Brian, you get to ask the first question.
Sounds good. So to your specific point that you just made about the learned helplessness, obviously we all consume a significant amount of media. We see World War III happening. We see all these challenges with the biosphere and the environment and so forth. And at the same time, we zoom out and look at human history. Every metric is up and to the right, right? Health, child mortality is down, the number of violence is down, longevity is up, and so forth, right? The number of percentage of the population that is educated, and so forth. So why don't we consider the fact that we're past that point of inflection of technology, where we're now in a vertical space where things are happening much faster than people can adapt to them. What recommendations would the two of you guys make to people that are watching and listening here, as well as the people watching on video, on how do you adapt to a changing environment that's changing faster than any time in human history, to be able to stay ahead of the curve and be able to continue contributing to society at large?
You want to tackle it first or you want me? I can jump on. All right, I'll jump on that one. Well, first, and I don't know if you intended this or not, but I will say this is why I actually love what Brian's doing, and he didn't pay me to say this or anything like that. The beauty of education is the ability to experiment and simulate with possible futures before you go out and do them. Because we only have one era of time, we only get one chance to do this, but if you can practice, rehearse, and simulate before you do it, it's not going to be perfect. Nobody's perfect, and please don't try to be perfect. But you have a better chance of landing something that you like and adjusting along the way. I do think that points to, one, our obligation to make sure education is available to as many people as possible, because otherwise we are robbing not just them, but ourselves collectively of a better future. And two, to think about how we make it timely and relevant, recognizing the sort of pull and push of, yes, people want to deal with how am I going to keep on having a job, how am I going to have a better job in the here and now. But if you only focus on that, then you're also not lifting their eyes to the possible even better future beyond just themselves. And again, I was fortunate enough that I had parents in early age that said, if you have talents, you have an obligation to use them to help others. I don't know how you do that and ingraining that in education across different cultures, because different cultures are going to have different ways of expressing that. But regardless, it's recognizing that there's both the knowledge that you need to navigate the world, but then there's also the knowledge you need to be a more full human in the sense that I'm connected with you, Brian, and vice versa, and everybody in this room.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would start by saying something I love to say is education is what others do to you, learning is what you do for yourself. And I think this is a point about we're entering a culture where it's so essential to be lifelong learners, where we're kind of going back to that notion of being a Renaissance person, in that we've been highly specialized to such a point that, it's very rare for someone to understand the whole picture. And so having interdisciplinary interests, like connecting the dots, being the connective tissue, is so essential here. But also I would say there's something deeper here that might be where this emerging consciousness journey, this collective quest, from the hero's journey to the collective quest, from the me to the we, from the I is illness to we is wellness kind of points, and that's I think this emerging trust in the immune system response that is happening at the collective level right now. I'm in such a privileged position that I've listened to well over 1,000 of the most genius, greatest minds and creators, architects of the future I know in the world, share their visions of the future with me in the last 5 years, that we've been inviting people to storytell the future. And I've seen unbelievable strategies and visions coming down the pipe that most people don't get to see, because they're seeing what the media is portraying, which is the future is so dystopic. And so I think the crisis is, it's like becoming the crisis, if you see what I mean. And so what I would say is trusting and kind of surrendering. There's a great book called The Surrender Experiment. Surrendering to this awareness that the planet herself is intelligent, and there's intelligence at play here beyond ourselves as individuals. And I would invite each of us to reflect on our role in this moment in time as T cells. T cells is the immune system response that you have T cells in your body. T cells will communicate with other T cells to fight an infection. Our planet has an infection. It's kind of humanity right now. And so those of us that are recognizing our role in this unique moment in time are like the planet's, like Gaia's immune system response. We're like the planetary T cells sharing codes with each other to get this job done. But what I have is childlike faith, deep confidence, conviction that we know how the story ends, that love wins, that we get there, that this moment, that this particular moment, that we can get through this crisis, that we are born for this mission, and that this is a huge honor to show up and be part of this. And so to challenge the narrative, rather than, people do jobs they don't enjoy, to buy shit they don't like, they buy shit they don't need to impress people they don't like, rather than that world, how do we evolve to become a planetary team of teams to rise to the occasion? Because, you're not going to be able to eat your dollars in a dying world. And so we really need a lot more of us at this moment, and that's the key point. It's don't be conquered by dystopia and apathy. And probably one of the most dangerous things we have right now is apathy in the belief of possibility. So, let's enchant people. It's more important what we stand for than what we stand against. Let's enchant people in the possibility of this moment in time.
Comments, yes, and then I think we have a question and another question. So go, Crick, and then we'll.
So number one, a quote from Chuck Palahniuk was not on my Davos bingo this year, so that's awesome. Number two, one of the things I know, both of your answers were absolutely brilliant, but my father instilled the exact same idea in me, that those who have capabilities or resources or intelligence have a duty and obligation to the rest of the human race. There was this idea in the northeast of the United States, obviously we have a lot of tribes, this idea of noblesse oblige, that if you do have resources, you have to reach down and help other people. And so I think the question you asked is probably the most prescient and important question facing all of us here in Davos and World Economic Forum of how do we instill this idea, because if we don't all work collectively together to solve these problems, we're all going to have a really bad time. And to quote Pablo Solman, who was on the stage 5 or 6 times, boycott dystopia. We can create the world that we're all going to be proud of and happy with, so let's do that together.
Love it. And I think we have a question over here real quick. I'm going to actually, one thing that I feel that is also necessary is almost like if you have the effort to try and do the story, as one who often gets sent by different forces, political, organizational, whatever, to be the person that says, we've tried this 9 different times, it hasn't worked, you're now number 10, see what you can do. We also will need to have an operationalized element. And I'm not talking about a single check that says, go forth and make the story happen. We're going to have to think about structures that involve folks at the local level that maybe are micro awards or micro incentives, and may not even be financial incentives. But, we need to do something that takes the vision but then translates it to implementation. And so obviously a conversation for another day, but the operational person in my brain is going, oh, there's so much to terms of how do you link the stories once done to making it done. But I'm now going to go, since you had a question.
So, Brian, first of all, kudos, man. This has been probably one of my favorite houses of the entire...
Yeah.
You have talked to tribal people, and I will say this has probably been one of my most favorite conversations. You two are brilliant, and it's not just from a mind space, it's from a heart space, and how you just bring that, because, the longest journey, we always say, is from the head to the heart. So you both just encompass that complete harmony, and I just love you both, and I'm so excited that I was here to witness this today.
It's mutual.
My question is this. So, my heart is with the underserved, right? And I dropped the golden handcuffs, and I don't care what it's going to take, because I will not fail. and we're gonna go do what we're trying to do to make our lives, to bring hope to the most, desolate places where such adversity is there. But I think we can look at the most adverse places in the world and change some of the most complex problems we have faced through what we can bring to them. Because you know why? Because they're the ones that's open to change, and because they have nothing else, right? So when we talk about that, how do we bring that to the refugee camps? I'm all about reimagining capital, right? Human capital, reimagining human capital. So how do we take what you're talking about? How do we bring United Planet and put it in the hands of the kids that I just walked away from in Jordan in over 18 refugee camps? How do we let them talk about creating the future? How do we let them play with that? And then use whatever we use AI on the back end to start looking and showing to the rest of our leaders in the world, this is what our generations or the next generations are thinking of. I don't care if they're 10 or if they're 15 or if they're 3, right? I mean, how do we start getting those and ideas and putting them out there, right? But even how do we start, because hope changes everything. How do we start to bring hope to those communities through bringing education, through bringing health services, through bringing those things? How do you see that happening where we can do that? Because, you're right, we are the cavalry. I don't give a crap who's in the White House in Washington. I don't even know if I'm going to vote this year. I'm so upset. But the bottom line is, how do we do that? And how do we do that collectively, start working? Because we've got to reach these kids. Because they should not be forgotten. So how do we do that?
So, good. Well, you're good. Yeah.
I love you too. Thank you for everything you do. We we love you. We love you too. Firstly, I couldn't agree more with you. And we're living in a world that is dual in every way. It's at zero sum. We're drunk on finite games. We've been deeply conditioned by finite games in an infinite world. And so we need to transition from us and them to all of us or none of us. And so how do we design our world to include all? Now this is a great question. This is a great design challenge that every single citizen of planet Earth, spaceship Earth, every single crew member is invited to. Every single person on this planet, including other species, because we're going to star drop all the dogs' citizenship to United Planet too, because dogs don't have national citizenship. I would say one of the key problems is nations have a monopoly on ideas of the future. We're continuing to give this crazy notion that countries can actually address planetary challenges. They were never designed for it. They're ineffective at it. Can we just wake up and accept that? Like we've been at COP for the last few years. It's ridiculous. And actually Donald Trump nailed it in a quote. He said, I was elected to represent the people of Pittsburgh, not Paris. That's the problem. It's a zero-sum game. And when nations are in competition with each other for resources, they are never going to serve the planetary commons. Never. So we need to design parallel systems that include refugee camps, include migrating nations, are able to give dignity to every single person on this planet and future generations. And so an example of this is one of the games we did called Planetary Nation. We developed a story that it was actually the African continent, that we went from consciousness to community to culture to continents to civilizations. And it was the African continent that led the planet into a planetary identity. And it was something that was always there, that it's the Ubuntu culture. I am because we are. All of us rise together. And Ubuntu culture has been there. It's been there since the dawn of civilization. We all came from Africa. And as the story goes, we're all walking each other home. So I had the deep honor at Africa Night to share this story from the future, that it was actually the African continent that led the world back into a planetary identity. And I think this is key, is that it's all about who do we include in our sphere. Because so many of us are being conditioned by tribalism to separate an other and blame and apply fear. Ultimately, in this question, Davos is about how this question of rebuilding trust. Well, it's actually a ridiculous point, as if trust was ever there in the first place. You can't rebuild something that wasn't there in the first place. But if we really simplify this as polarities, the opposite of love is not hate, it's fear. The expression of love is trust. The expression of fear is distrust. So how do we design our world based on the frequency of love? What a simple idea.
So I'm going to build on what you said, first applause, as the operational guy. And first note, with your beautiful question, it observes that we are currently held by three systems that we need to overcome. The first, again, sorry, Wes, but it's economics. Economics assumes a planet that has infinite resources. We know the planet does not have infinite resources. And when I debate this with economists, they're like, oh, we can get to space. I'm like, space is really expensive. It's really hard to get to. And our bodies aren't adapted for it. So yes, you're just avoiding the fact that economics assumed an infinite planet, which is not the case. So we need to update that. The second is, and this was what you were talking about with nations, geopolitics. You know, even in our best, recognizing we aren't necessarily best, but we're moving ideally to do what we can. In our best forms of government, whether they're democracies, etc., they are only defined by that geography. And they are only meant to do those interests of those people. And so when you overlap that, it's a challenge. The third, unfortunately, is our biology. Recognizing we are here at the Ahura House, and we are a very small subset of the world, not to mention, you know, the history of species, but most humans are not net givers. And that's just because that's what's happened as a result of evolution. Now, again, through story, through rituals, through patterns, through education, through learnings, you can try to have people who are not a net giver be motivated to be such, but you are confronting the fact that biology, for better or for worse, not all humans are net givers. So that said, implicit in your question is actually the stat now is with what's happening with climate change, 1 in 3 of us will be displaced people for more than 3 months in our lifetime. And so that's the first hook, is you make it so it's not a, here's these people over here that I have no association with. It's that this could be me, this could be my kids, this could be my family. You first do that. Second, again, what you were saying about nation states can't solve this, and again, that's what the things that are there, we've got to think about networks. Now, sadly, there was a thing called ID 2020, and we can debate the pros and cons, but it was trying to recognize that you need to have a network sovereignty for displaced people. Again, recognize that could be all of us. And that's going to challenge the nation-state system, and it's going to experience disinformation attacks like ID 2020 and other things like that. But that way we have to come up with a strategy that says, how are we going to take this story of how we moved from nations by geography to networks by identity and ideology of a better world together? And so we've got to think about networks for these displaced individuals and think about where it goes. And then finally, what is the social contract, the civil contract, recognizing that we're in a world in which social contracts are breaking down in nation states to begin with? What is a social contract if you choose to be a networked individual? And it's giving them dignity. I may even challenge and say, maybe we need to also think about how displaced people that actually want to join this network have the access to education. And then from there, let's go through all the UN SDGs, which sadly the UN SDGs we've not made a lot of progress on, again, for the reasons there. But what does it mean to try and achieve the UN SDGs for networked people on the planet as well? So that would be the 3 steps that I would do. Love it. Think we got a lot of work to do, but.
Brigham.
Thank you so much. As probably many people here, I love both the analysis and the narrative, and this is exactly what we need in this moment. There have been some questions about operationalization, and I come from a background of sociology, PhD in sociology at UC Berkeley. I think this is, some aspects of this discipline are what we're hoping for or grasping for. I had the experience, I want to pose something as a hypothesis for your commentary. I had the experience when I was getting my PhD, and I went very cutely, naively, so I could understand how the world works better, so that maybe if I'm in some position of power, like the people at WEF in the secure zone, that I could do so responsibly. But I noticed along the way that this kid, Zuckerberg, got 1 billion people dancing his dance in a decade. And it took Christianity, Islam, the Chinese civilization, 1,000 years to get 1 billion people doing anything. And it's not because he's so charming, it's because of this internet communications technology. So I want to pose as a hypothesis that in our technological development that has gone vertical, as Brian says, we started going like this, and with internet communications tech, and then we see AI, and we're like, oh, AI, now let's be at this point. But actually, there's a ton of work we can do at the level of internet communications. We can take those same building blocks that we're using to share cat photos and argue with our uncles, and actually put them together in different pieces that create collectively intelligent systems that we can then point at the complex and challenging parts of social reality to solve problems like misinformation and so forth. What were your comments?
So one, absolutely agree. And actually, I think it may very well be 50, 100, 200 years from now, they will look and say, here was these individual agents collectively building tighter communications to each other. Not just digital communications, because there's pros and cons, but building tighter communications. Now, there's a whole lot of challenges coming down the turnpike. I've been part of conversations both in August and then in December with some different world governments about it is going to be near impossible to distinguish what's authentic versus inauthentic online by 2030, if not sooner. Generative AI, which sadly a lot of people were talking about, is only going to make that worse. And sadly, already we're seeing it being targeted more at women than men in terms of harassment, hate. When a woman decides to run for political office or take a public-facing government job, she gets between 10 to 15 times the amount of hate and vitriol. And sadly, there's strong evidence that's at least 80% bot-generated. So it's not even human. And so something's wrong with the world in which that's where we're going into. But at the same time, I always look at, they may have meant it for bad. Where can we find the good? And so, again, I'm not saying we threw the baby out the bathwater with the internet. We do need to recognize, I am not hopeful. To me, success would be if next year, instead of talking about AI, we're talking about collective intelligence. Because that's not just machine-based, it's about humans. And it's also recognized there is a science of it, because too. You create shared goals, that's where, and if people buy into those shared goals, a diversity of perspectives actually lead to better outcomes. But you can't do a diversity of different activities unless you have shared goals. And sadly, the UN SDGs are not operational. That's a problem. We need to fix that. We need to actually have very specific stories that then try to figure out how to make that happen. But the second thing I think is, in some respects, where we're trying to go, you're absolutely right, that there's rapid adoption of the shiny. What we really want to do in some respects is I don't want you to sort of click on or sign down or download or whatever it might be. What I really want to do is encourage a movement that asks people to reflect within and then figure out what small thing can I do. And again, I think it's almost in some respects for those people who are displaced and not empowered, for those people that are empowered but are feeling a sense of learned helplessness, which is a lot of privileged people right now feel like they can't do anything. I talk to them and they're just like, it's so big, where do I start? And I'm like, just do something small. It doesn't even have to be your full-time job. It could just be something you do as a volunteer activity on the side. But from that, if we link it to these larger stories and these larger stories are continuously being updated, then I think, again, I'm actually an optimist. I actually do think, part and parcel to your comment, Brian, the world is moving towards a more perfect state that we may look back and say, again, we were part of that collective, that our brains were collectively intelligent, that the species that were around us were collectively intelligent, and we were part of this orchestration of a jazz movement towards something. But part of it is what melody do we want to play and what harmonies do we want to add?
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, David. Yeah. This is where, from artificial intelligence to augmented intelligence, how are we applying the best of us on behalf of all of us to create the future that includes all of us? And, as the saying goes in AI, junk in, junk out. If we're programming AI with more fear, more separation, more profit-seeking, rent-seeking behaviors, we're going to get that out the other end. And so I think it's never been so important that we return to this ancient future idea that certain societies of the past, if you look at the principles that the Templars applied, it was a noble, the age of knights, for example. There was a sacrifice and a service that took place. And so, we say before we begin any up game, we say the Gaian oath, which is very simple, but it's an oath, and an oath is a very important thing. It goes like this: we are a united planet. I am Gaian. On my honor, I commit to a thriving civilization in harmony with all life. So think of this, I think of this as like the time traveler's Hippocratic Oath. But this notion that we're committing to bring what is true, what is beautiful, and what is what is in service of all of us into these tools and these technologies so that we can program them for thriving, I think is the key. And so this is this moment where I do believe this decade, I personally believe this is the golden decade. This is what Buckminster Fuller called the design science decade, where he predicted this decade that would come where every aspect of our world would be redesigned to work for 100% of all life. And that he predicted that there was going to be a world game. He talked about this in 1961. There was going to be a world game where every aspect of our world would be gamified, such as to work for 100% of all life. What an amazing vision he had. So we have elders, we have prophecies that indigenous people have been speaking of these moments in time. And so I would say that if we can flip the script, and if we could recognize that this is the golden decade, this is the decade where we build a bridge from the old to the new, this is the decade where we do this, and this is why we have at United Planet a mission, an invitation, to say we would like to have 1 billion Gaian citizens by 2030. We would like to be a planetary platform cooperative, where instead of Facebook owning all of those users' data, what a novel idea that you own it, with everyone else that participates in it. You know, we're going to see the rise of cooperatives, but the rise of cooperatives that are so much bigger and better because they're applying the collective will and intent of all of us. So this is such a unique moment in time. I feel so honored to be part of this amazing orchestra of change makers, making the best music we can possibly dance to in this moment. And just having this trust that we get there, that we can do this, and that it is really the limit of our horizon of our vision. Because AI is almost like this magical enabler of us to rapidly bridge the gap between our visions and our reality. So let's dream better dreams.
Well said. So unless there's a question, maybe what I would like to suggest is I feel like, one, probably people need to get some either caffeine or food, but then two, before you leave, can we do a group photo of everybody together here?
I think it's a great idea. Well, first of all, let's hear it for our amazing speaker.